Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that wonders, with Trump gone, what else is there to talk about? And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Tom?
Yeah, not bad. I don't know why it feels like there's a lifting on, like a great weight has lifted off us, and I think a lot of people on the internet have been talking about this the last week and a bit since the inauguration. So yeah, I think we'll get onto this in our main story later, but like, things have changed. There's a lot to talk about when we get onto that outside of our headlines. But things feel a bit different, and it's nice. It's been a nice change.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot going on at the moment, but it's just like one less thing to worry about. You know, you can kind of push it to the side and go, okay, now I can focus on all the other terrible things happening in the world. But yeah, it's definitely a new era, let's say.
Yes, certainly. And, well, as I say, we'll get into that in a moment. But first, let's go on into our headlines. Just a little update here that we were previously using a Tumblr that kept these things up to date. That was really handy. Unfortunately, that seems to no longer being maintained. So it's kind of, we can't really go through all of the headlines that have happened now very easily. So we're just trying to grab them as and when we see them. I suppose if you see a headline you think we should talk about, you can tweet it at us and then we'll have it and put it in our show notes. But yeah, we just need, this week that was a bit of a change. So in future headlines, we're going to try and be on it. But again, might miss something. If you think there's something you want us to talk about, throw it at us. So talking about the UK, what's going on with Brexit? And I think it was Fish this time that's been Fish that was such a big deal that it kept being mentioned in the press in the run-up to the deal being done. How's that kind of worked out in the long run?
Yeah, not so well. And I would say it's not just the press, but Boris Johnson as well made it a big part of his campaign. I don't know if you remember, in a speech at the Conservative Party conference, he literally held up a fish, like prepackaged, and said, "This is what we're doing Brexit for, rah, rah, rah." But that appears to be one of the industries that is really struggling with finding out the implications of the new deal that we have with the EU. One of the big defences of this, if you want me to give you the official Conservative Party defence of their actions when it comes to fisheries, Jacob Rees-Mogg said in the Commons that the fish are at least British fish, which means they're happier now.
Yep. That's obviously how that works.
Yes. You taking on the role of the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle there, who said, he pretty much said, well, yeah, that's a fact, kind of ironically, but that is, it's not any bias from myself here. I am merely repeating what the Conservative minister said in the House of Commons as a defence to their current fishing policy, which is kind of astounding. You've got big ports up and down the country and like packing depots. There's pictures of that completely empty at the moment as demand for British fish appears to have plummeted. And there has been even a protest by some members of the industry with a big lorry that went outside Parliament just to say, by the way, we feel that we've been let down by the government on this part of the deal. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know all the ins and outs of that fishing agreement with the EU. It's clearly complicated. But what is clear at the moment is that it's having an impact on an industry, not only with their ability to sell items and get them through the ports quick enough so fish doesn't go off. Obviously, it's a very time-sensitive item if you want to try and get it through fresh as possible. But it's not only problems with distribution, it's clearly problems with getting it into other EU countries, meeting their standards, etc., etc. So, we always said that there would be, there might be good points and bad points on Brexit, and you'd have to weigh them up. At the moment, this appears to be one of the more negative points, and bizarrely, it's attacking one of the industries that Brexit seemed to claim it would save, or one that would benefit from an increased amount of sovereignty. So I think that's why it's caught the public eye so much at the moment. The government's other defence, apart from the fact that the fish are British now, is that these are extraordinary times for everybody around the world with various, coronavirus restrictions. That might be what's holding things up at the port, certainly before Christmas when just before the New Year, where France closed its borders as we had news of the new strain coming through. There are kind of still tests ongoing at the border to make sure that no viruses are being brought in by UK lorry drivers or whoever's in the UK driving lorries into the continent. So that is slowing down things too. But yes, it's certainly painting a very messy picture with Brexit. And I do feel that if we weren't currently in a pandemic, these things would be making headline news a lot more. it does seem to be the fact that we're in a lockdown and that is affecting everybody economically, I think is masking the potential impact of Brexit, and we can't truly know what that influence will be until we're sort of on the other side of the other crises that are going on.
And continuing the Brexit theme, after all of this hassle that there has been at the ports, there's fish was a very specific thing, and there was a protest where a load of fishing companies drove down outside Parliament. But the other thing, there's been lots of problems with people trying to get things through. Particularly, we mentioned last time there was this new paperwork that has been slowing people down. And then you were getting stories of like the lorry is here and has the paperwork. Something's wrong with the paperwork. So now the lorry has to stay overnight. So you get charged like an expensive parking fee. And then the documentation itself is no longer valid because it has a certain time limit on it. And all sorts of things going on like as they deal with these basic kind of issues and try and sort everything out. But I suppose the big thing was this article I shared from The Guardian, which is move to EU to avoid Brexit costs, firms told.
Yeah, that was official advice given by people over the phone, by civil servants, essentially saying, well, the easiest and quickest way around these new rules and restrictions as a UK business is if you set up some sort of business in the EU itself. Therefore, all of that paperwork can kind of go through that subsidiary and you'll bypass a lot of it. It appears like a little loophole in there. What's astounding about that, I guess, is that is official advice coming from government officials who you would expect to say that, oh no, the UK can cope with this. Trying to encourage more small businesses to set up headquarters in the EU doesn't seem to me to be a great way to be promoting British business or persuading people to set up businesses in the UK. It appears that the quickest and easiest option for anybody wanting to do trade with the UK at the moment is between the UK and the EU is to set up a business in the EU, which I thought kind of defeats one of the other purposes of Brexit, which meant to give us more economic freedom to do things. So it's these little unintended consequences that are all coming out. I don't think there has been one sort of big moment yet. The biggest moment would be if all of a sudden supermarkets started running out of food, for example. I think that was the one that hit people the most, and you'd see it front pages if that was happening throughout the country, although there had been reported shortages.
There have been kind of isolated stories like shortages of certain types of fresh fruit,
Yes.
Things like that.
Yeah, but I don't think it's happened on a large enough scale for it to really feel that there's been one big impact of boom, we were out on the 1st and suddenly everything's gone to pot. But it's these small items that I think will build up over time and might help to dismiss some of those EU myths. Because I think one of those big EU myths was, we should leave the EU so we can cut a lot of red tape and get out of this endless bureaucracy of the EU. But it turns out we've just replaced that bureaucracy with even more bureaucracy we need to do trade with the EU anyway. So, and that's even more complicated than what we were in before. Maybe it turns out, shock horror, that having certain things aligned with the EU actually made trade a lot easier. And that was the point of it in the first place. But still, yes, we're having, the government would call it teething problems. And I think it's, it would be remiss of me to say that, this is going to happen forever and ever and ever. The deal was always one that came through very late. And, if it was thousands of pages long and most of the MPs who voted on it didn't have time to read the whole thing. So it's no wonder that businesses are struggling to react to the nuances of what's needed and what's required by these new rules. I'm just kind of, it's annoying that this has only happened now. It's only being realised now once we've done it, rather than these arguments that happened before with the referendum. But hey, we've had, 5 years of this. We're in this situation now. We'll see how we get through it. The last point I wanted to add on that was that I saw a news story tonight that apparently Amazon is going to restrict sales of alcohol in Northern Ireland, or essentially take it off as not being able to be delivered into Northern Ireland because of
due to the customs rule. Yeah.
Which is worrying, because you'd imagine that lots of small businesses, it's entirely understandable if they can't get their heads around the custom rules, or there's lots of people sort of saying, I was independent and it's just me and I don't have time to go through this government website to try and find out what's going on, or it's more time, it's more money than it's worth. But Amazon should have the time and resources to work out how to get alcohol to Northern Ireland. And if they can't, then obviously that's a big worry for, hey, what else can't you get to Northern Ireland? What else can't they get done? So,
It might also be, I mean, Northern Ireland has always been interesting for things like this. Like something we're well aware of is, every time there's like open a packet of crisps and win 50 quid kind of offer on. That's the first type of one that springs to mind, but nearly all chocolate bars or whatever, whenever they have some kind of offer thing where it's like collect a number of wrappers or whatever, you look on the back and it always says excluding Northern Ireland. So there's always been issues like this going on, but it's kind of shocking that it's suddenly like, oh, well, you can't buy an entire range of things from Amazon, as you say, because if Amazon can't get their lawyers on it and sort out a way to do it that's reasonable, I mean, you might expect a change in prices, perhaps. But yeah, it is kind of wild that that's where we're left. But people said this is what would happen if we weren't in the single market. It's not surprising. But yeah, I think bits of the deal people will start to realise. I suppose it will really be interesting where we are in a month or two's time. Well, maybe slightly more than that. But like, if we're thinking optimistically, let's say 6 months' time, lots of people are vaccinated and life is becoming more normal again. Will people start to pick up on these stories more? I mean, they're definitely being reported in the news, but it's not a thing the average person is talking about at the moment. People are more annoyed at the various restrictions in place and stuff like that. And that's a perfect segue into our next kind of final headline point, the latest in the coronavirus response. So vaccines are rolling out, aren't they? But I think there's been some concerns about certain things with that.
Yeah, I believe it's the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is the Oxford one as well. They've paired up with them. Essentially, when these vaccine contracts went out at the start of the pandemic, a lot of people were asked to place bids on them, essentially, and say, I would like this much vaccine for this much money. Thank you very much. And of course, with the Oxford one, Britain got in there first and ordered their million vaccines, or, their millions of vaccines. And the EU got in later and they paid more for a larger amount of vaccines, but the bulk cost brought the cost of a vaccine down. So, those scales of, there's a name for it, I can't remember it, but anyway, that's the scales you get. And the EU is expecting a lot of this vaccine very soon. It turns out that the supply chain, or at least production of that vaccine, has been lower than expected, which means the vaccine is likely to get to Europe later than they want, and that has caused some tension between Europe and the UK. There are stories that the EU might restrict some sales of the vaccine or block it getting to the UK if they're trying to get like the Pfizer one, which I believe comes from Germany, etc. So there is a little bit more tension, I would say, about who gets the vaccine and where it's being distributed around the world. The UK is sort of we're in a very odd position because we hit a grim milestone today, didn't we, with 100,000 deaths?
Hard to compute sorrow of 100,000 deaths PM, so yeah.
Yeah, so it's been 100,000 deaths, and at one stage, I believe that we were told by Chris Whitty that if we get out of this with 20,000 deaths, that will be considered a success. So to be 5 times over that is, represents a failure somewhere along the line. And the government has said they're incredibly sorry, and there's a bit of reflection to do that on, how we could have done better in that as a country, because I think we're the 5th country to reach that milestone, but the ones who have reached that one so far are the US, Brazil, India, and somewhere else, Mexico. That was it. But you would take those countries and go, oh, they've got much higher populations than us and a greater population density. All of those factors, I think we consider that we've contained it quite poorly, and maybe the new variant hasn't helped with that, particularly in recent months, if certain restrictions or whatever aren't having quite the same effect. So we've had that, but on the other hand, we've been able to vaccinate people or get the vaccine out in its first stage to quite a few. The figure that came out of the Daily Briefing today was about 1 in 8 all adults in the UK have had their first vaccine, which is kind of incredible when you think about it at that stage of how much, they've been able to achieve in such a short period of time. So I am, grateful for the government that they're doing well with the vaccine program. And it sounds like as a country, we really need it if we're the ones being affected by it. Or have been affected by it, at that level. We need it sooner rather than later. So it's been, I would say, a very mixed week of coronavirus response. We now look to the future. I think people are starting to get kind of like cabin fever. We're in lockdown 3, and that first lockdown, we didn't really know when it would end, but I think people were willing for it to go on a little longer because, they were more accepting that it might drag on because one of the theories was, oh, well, if we do it once and we do it right, then that's fine. we're in our third lockdown now, and everybody's kind of like, oh, can we get out of it yet, please? When are schools going to be back open? All of these questions are starting to come to the surface. And even though numbers are starting to go down, I think clearly the government is wary, particularly of this new variant, how easily it can spread. And if you open up for just like a week or two, we might have to have another lockdown soon after that. But yeah, the people are discussing about how easily the virus spread, maybe through one day of meeting up with people on Christmas. If we open up a week too early, then it can undo a lot of hard work that we've been able to achieve over this past month of being locked down. So yeah, tough decision for the government, more on the horizon, but I think the vaccine news is at least the bright spark that's keeping everyone going. It's certainly helping me a lot anyway.
I suppose we should move on into our main story. So our main story tonight is going to be the inauguration, and I think you also want to maybe make some points about Trump's presidency and where things are now that he's left. So yeah, do we want to start off with like just a quick rundown of what happened on that day?
Yeah, I think what was particularly odd about this inauguration day, usually it's all about kind of one man, the new president, getting, finally to take the stand and take his seat. But this one is slightly different. As we mentioned previously, Trump had decided not to attend the inauguration. So there was this sort of bizarre circus around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock our time. I think it was about 8, 9 o'clock in the morning for everybody in the US, or at least on the East Coast. But this sight of Trump leaving the White House for the last time. So you had a shot of him and Ivanka walking out together to the military helicopter, which I believe is Marine One. They went up and did a big tour over Washington, D.C., just to see, apparently that is a traditional thing that happens to all presidents once they usually leave the inauguration. They kind of have a flyover of the city to kind of have a look at it. Trump's flyover, of course, would have been over a deserted city inhabited by military personnel because of the actions of January the 6th and the insurrection that took place there. So I felt that was quite bizarre. Secondly, he landed at a base just outside to kind of give a farewell address. It was pointed by the news coverage that this wasn't teleprompter Trump. This was off the cuff Trump, which always means that it might be a little bit more racy and you're not quite sure what he's going to say. But I felt it was fairly tame. One of the more striking things is that he didn't mention Joe Biden by name at all. He didn't really concede either. He recognized the inauguration was going ahead, but his failure to even accept the results of the election on Inauguration Day was also kind of worrying and a bit sad. And looking at that scene, there's a lot of things that kind of like uniquely Trump about them that wouldn't happen otherwise. So music was blaring. They had Gloria playing in the background and the YMCA before he landed in the plane and came down. There was a modest and small crowd, including his family, but none of those people in the crowd, as far as I could see, wore a mask or socially distanced. It all sort of happened and pretended to go on as if the coronavirus wasn't a thing. And then the final bizarre shot of this Trump presidency, I don't know if you saw it, but because he had this soundtrack in the background, you saw Air Force One taking off on his way to Florida, to the base there, with Frank Sinatra's My Way playing in the background. And it was such, for me, like a reality TV program moment. And I guess he was the reality TV president in a sense. He certainly did it his way, but that meant that he'd not done it in the way that the 44 presidents preceding him had ever considered doing it. So, yes, I just felt all of that was fairly odd, was typically Trump. And I felt as we hadn't really given the guy a proper send-off in our last podcast because he decided to incite an insurrection, I felt it's kind of like our duty here just to kind of like reflect back on the last 4 years of Trump, how well he did, and what he's changed, I guess, in American politics.
So I think that's definitely something people are talking about a lot right now, because a lot of things have been undone with the swish of a pen, because of how he ruled by executive order, essentially. But so what did he actually achieve with policy? Because a lot of stuff, as we say, executive order stuff has been rolled back already.
Yeah, so I think if you want to have a look at the lasting legacy of Trump, where you can actually sort of nail it down and go, yeah, that probably had a long-term impact or was within the realm of what this president can achieve and might last beyond 4 years. I think that his tax cuts in early 2017 was something that at least helped big business to really boom under Trump in his past 4 years. And the economy was something that he always went on about and was maybe one of his strengths and one of the reasons so many people stuck with him for as long as they did. In a lot of his speeches, he mentioned like, oh, your 401k is up because of me. The stock market is doing great, etc., etc. And that was kind of why big business kept supporting him, or was one of the reasons. So I think that will last. I'm sure Biden will consider tax rises to fund what is probably quite a big deficit from COVID-19 and the effects of that. But at least in the short term, I think that is one sort of, if you agree or disagree with the economics of tax cuts and how fairly that wealth is distributed amongst people, I think you can at least say for the American economy, it appeared to grow under Trump considerably. And he would mark that as one of his successes. Another one, it's hard to qualify if this is a success or not, but he certainly shaped foreign policy in his image and was able to achieve some things that no president had before. Maybe most notably was that meeting with Kim, the North Korean leader, and the potential progress that they made there. At least it was very, I think many serious foreign correspondents would say that that was all quite superficial in the end. Although he actually got Kim around a table and got him to go to South Korea and do all these did they go to South? I thought they went to like a meeting room in South Korea, or at least on the border in the DMZ. To get those talks happening is certainly a momentous moment, and probably could only be achieved by Trump's unique mix of reality star president / strongman, somebody who was willing to say, hey, maybe I'll nuke North Korea, maybe I won't, maybe I'll go to war with you. For some bizarre reason, that got them both around the table. However, it appears, at least, in the long term, again, that won't stick at all. Particularly during the last 2 years of the Trump presidency, promises of another meeting like that were kind of conditional on North Korea trying to get some economic sanctions lifted from them. That was kind of what they wanted. They wanted a quid pro quo for another meeting, and Trump was unwilling to give that to them. So eventually no progress was made, and we're kind of back to square one with North Korea. But for a moment there, it appeared he made some progress. And I think Trump supporters themselves, one thing that was touted by Trump himself as well, is that America has gotten involved in no new wars since Trump was president, which I guess is, which is an achievement in itself. I'd say America was already tied up in quite a few wars already, and couldn't afford to do it. Like they were still, Trump promised to pull a lot more troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq, and ended up reneging on those promises because his advisors basically said, you can't do this without destabilizing the region. Quite a bit. That there was certainly no flashpoint within the last 4 years where where he could have started. Let me start again. There was no flashpoint where he did start a war, although his ability to threaten one certainly wasn't dialed down. If you think back to January of 2020, some people were worried about World War III because they were worried that Trump might get involved in Iran in a certain way. So I think maybe it might just be circumstance, or maybe that, the coronavirus, again, I'm not saying Trump would have done a war there, but there are certain things that took over towards the end of his presidency, which just meant that wasn't feasible. But yes.
Yeah, so I think the other kind of big lasting thing he's done is there's been a lot outside of the Supreme Court. There's been a general push to get more conservative judges in by the Republican Party. But then with Trump in the lead, he's actually managed to significantly change the balance of the Supreme Court, which is a thing that currently is a lifetime appointment and therefore is actually going to be a lasting change. Yeah,
I would stress that is his most important lasting legacy, is the fact that he's not only changed a lot of federal courts, but getting those 3 Supreme Court justices in. I mean, he is very much that was just circumstance, right? He was just lucky that he got 3 Supreme Court nominees within a 4-year period. Some presidents can go for 8 years and get maybe 1 or 2. The fact he was able to do 3 in a single term, helped by the fact, obviously, that the scalier the Justice Scalia appointment was delayed from the Obama presidency because you had a Senate that was unwilling to work with President Obama at the time to get his preferred nominee appointed. And then, of course, you had RGB's passing very near the end of Trump's term. He was kind of lucky in that sense that he could squeeze 3 into those 4 years. But that will be what will... Appointing 3 relatively young conservative justices to a court is a decision that potentially will have impacts for America 20, 30 years on if they stay the course. So yeah, that's why I think that's by far and away his most influential change that he was able to have over America in this time period. But it's kind of also Mitch McConnell's change. Like, Mitch McConnell must take a lot of credit for delaying the first appointment and getting all the other ones through so quickly. So I do think that takes the shine off Trump, calling that his own personal achievement. He couldn't have done that without the help of at least his senators in Congress.
Yeah. So that's very so it is a long-lasting thing, but it's not necessarily his legacy itself. It is more like you could very much see when Republicans are trying to get re-elected that they could easily remove themselves from talking about Trump and just say that was the Republicans, because it was. So kind of moving on from that, talking about lasting things, what will his legacy be? He's certainly changed a lot of things, but it almost, how much of that will just go back into the background and how much of that is here to stay? So
I think one thing that Trump was able to show throughout his time in his 4 years in power is he kind of established, I don't think white nationalist is maybe too strong a word, but certainly maybe like a white identity politics and a culture war around those issues that he was able to run with and keep people interested with and make sure that he dominated the news cycle for 4 years. Like, I think if we think back to Trump and the last 4 years, one thing that will stick in our minds is all of the tweets he made, the controversial comments, how something could be how something controversial could happen on a Monday and be forgotten about by Friday because something else massive had turned up. And that it was certainly a very chaotic style of leadership and meant that there was a lot of engagement from both sides. Over the past 4 years, I felt like I had to be engaged in American politics more than I did, just because, well, one, you didn't know what was going to happen next. It was quite, unstable in that sense. And two, you wanted to make sure that you could react to what he was going to do, and for me personally, like, fight against it in some way. And that method of governing the country, I think, certainly helped to solidify his base. But at the end, the fact that his presidency finished with that insurrection in the Capitol, I think it's fair to say that he presided over a very divided country. There was nothing about Trump which I felt was conciliatory or reaching across the aisle or trying to unify people. I felt that a lot of what he did was trying to antagonize other people across the aisle and whip up his own base to try and maintain his support. And there's maybe another discussion here about, is that what we can expect from future politicians? Particularly within the Republican Party, can they take that method of, I think it's probably a uniquely Republican Party issue because by fluke or design, Republicans are able to win like Senate seats and the presidency due to the Electoral College and how things are distributed. They're able to win it with fewer votes than the Democrats, essentially. If you have 2 Republican senators for a very rural state with not much population and think that California, that is a very democratic state, has the same amount of senators and they're, massively different population. Republicans have these small sort of advantages in some electoral areas, which mean that they only really have to motivate that 40 to 45% of people within the country and they've got a path to victory. I think that's something that future Republicans might consider as a viable strategy, because before I feel they were trying to go for the median voter and go into the Democrats' base. I think under Trump, he didn't care about the median voter at all. It was all about him and his method. But again, I do feel that Trump's unique brand of celebrity gave him an advantage that I don't think other traditional Republicans would gain. For example, Ted Cruz, I think, is trying to take up the Trump mantle in a way in the Senate. He's the one saying the most Trumpy things and supporting Trump well after what happened in January 6th. But he's still massively unpopular with just the general public. And I don't feel that Ted Cruz could take the 40% he would need to win the Republican nomination or whatever it is, when probably he's only got the support of 20%. So that style of presidency, that method of, being divisive and seeing that work and getting votes, and he got 75 million votes, let's not forget, in the November election. I still wonder, is that a legacy that is viable for Republican leaders, or is that something that was just a flash in the pan and that was so uniquely Trump that we won't see it again?
I think as well, there's now so much talk for the Democrats about what they should do to kind of handle some of these inequalities, that it's going to be hard with us just controlling the Senate, but you could see moves to democratic reform being talked about already. So maybe all this maths will change, but will it change within 2 years? Or within 4 years for the president? But yeah,
I think the biggest one there is the suggestion that like Washington DC and Puerto Rico become states, which are quite traditionally like low population but high Democrat areas. I don't think that is likely to happen, but it's certainly one thing that Democrats could threaten moving forward.
I think DC becoming a state is one that my impression of it is that's more likely than Puerto Rico, even though Puerto Rico has had like Brexit level referendum on it, where they're like 50% of people would like this to happen, but it's not a 2/3 majority of the population in Puerto Rico who want it to happen yet. Whereas I think people in DC want to have that happen, even if the Senate is against it. So I think that's maybe slightly more likely, but again, within the next 4 years, we'd have to see. I suppose the other thing I want to just push on a bit more there is it's a more divided America, but wasn't it always this divided? And this has just kind of helped to see certain divisions clearer. I think a bit like how the Brexit vote has affected people's understanding of the electorate in the UK as well. This problem was already there, right? It's just that now we know it's there.
Yes, in a sense. So yeah, I think people had underlying feelings in that way. But it's really important who's in power, I think, about how you deliver that message, and sometimes soothing messages or conciliatory messages from a leader can help stop 5-10% of those people becoming more extreme in their views. Right. So I think one example, and this is maybe we'll have to wait and see the long-term effects of this, but Trump was banned from Twitter, right? Everybody knows that. And now he's not president anymore. Obviously, it's only been like about a week. But particularly in that week before, because he lost it pretty soon after the insurrection, you heard very little from him. And I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like there was a lot of lies and conspiracy theories and misinformation coming from the office of the president. And when somebody has that wider reach and is so easily able to spout whatever, and particularly when you're the president, people stand up and listen to what you're saying. I felt that him being in charge and never actively wanting to dispel division, but often provoke it, that led to a more divided country and at least turned some people who maybe wouldn't have considered themselves in the culture wars or wouldn't have considered these things, before, they get more extreme after the fact. I kind of feel the same about Brexit in a way. I feel that obviously the Brexit referendum was a period of high tension amongst the country, and, people talked about attacks going up on BAME people after the result of the referendum and felt that those people felt emboldened by that result. But I would say that the quality of our political discourse in the 5 years after Brexit has only really gone down as we feel more divided and we've got more people in power willing to promote that divide. I'm not saying Boris Johnson is Trump, but Boris Johnson, when it comes to attacking Remainers and talking about Brexit policy or the Cummings strategy as it was in the 2019 election, I think was incredibly divisive. And talks of unity have been fairly fleeting. I would, to go back to your original question, I would say, yes, there have always been these tensions in the country. Things like the Black Lives Matter movement that, would have happened under President Obama anyway. Like, that's not a uniquely Trump thing to happen. But the way Trump reacted to that and the way Trump mismanaged a lot of those situations, I think proves that if you have a poor leader in charge or somebody who's willing to stoke division, then you'll only get more disunity and more divided country rather than bringing at least some people together.
Yeah, I can see that. I think it was definitely a good thing for people to realise how divided the country, our respective countries were, though. That's like one of the results of these things. it's kind of opening Pandora's box, but by having the Brexit referendum, you suddenly realize that, oh, not everyone thinks like me. But at least if you know that, then you can deal with it. Like you can work on stuff coming together. And we have that specific problem that our current leadership in this country is not doing that. So maybe if Biden takes that tactic, and that's what he's been doing, he's been talking about unity and coming together as Americans and stuff like that, maybe that will start to have an effect. But the question, the thing that needs to kind of be focused on is, like the pollsters, people like that need to not forget that there are these other views that are out there and kind of get an understanding of them, I think.
No, I'd agree with that. I'd say the big example for that, for me, would be Black Lives Matter and the impact. I would say I was relatively like, racism is clearly a problem and is bad, but it's a very small minority of BNP people who feel that way. But now I've kind of taken on the motto of it's not enough to be not racist. You have to be actively anti-racist and trying to dissuade people from, like, I wouldn't have acted in that way. I wouldn't have the feeling to act in that way if I didn't realize that there were so many people who still kept this belief or had certain xenophobic beliefs, et cetera, in the country. So, yeah, no, I agree with your point there. I think that's incredibly valid. So
the other thing is, I know that the impeachment stuff is ongoing, but that aside, at the moment, what's Trump doing next? How's he going to spread his message to his followers now that he's no longer president, no longer has Twitter? And what can you tell me about this idea that there might be a third party, or there at least another political action committee, a new PAC coming up around Donald Trump?
Yeah, so one of the things Trump mentioned in his speech was that he would be back, in a sense, which has kind of felt a bit ominous. And I, at the time, thought maybe it was Trump trying to live rent-free in Democrats' heads by kind of saying, you'll never truly get rid of me. Like you feel like you've banished Darth Vader or whatever it is you've banished the big bad, but I'll be back for the sequel and it'll be worse. And one of his possible routes back in I thought was maybe going in for a third party called the Patriot Party, which you now inform me is some sort of PAC or super PAC that basically wields some influence or tries to lobby political parties within the American system to try and persuade them to act certain ways on policy. When I heard the idea of a third party and Trump running for it, I felt that was like unlikely. Trump knows that he's got a big base that would go with him, but I don't think Trump would have worked as a third party. He would never have got elected president if he was a third party candidate.
It sounds like there have been several of these things jumping up, and the Patriot Party specifically, which is a political action committee, a PAC, said that it was part of joint fundraising campaigns with Donald J. Trump for president, which is his specific campaign committee. And then they've disavowed, Donald Trump's disavowed that, his office has disavowed that. So, yeah, it seems like maybe there are people trying to kind of, bask in his particular brand of orange light.
Yeah, precisely. The comparison I was going to make with Trump was going back to 1992. Ross Perot ran for president against George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. And the comparisons between Perot and Trump are kind of similar. Like, Perot was a businessman who was very much outside of the system and wanted to, represent a choice outside of the two main parties, not exactly drain the swamp, but hey, take an outsider into Washington and I'll really shake things up. But the result of that was that he walked away with, although he got about 19% of the eventual votes in that election, he didn't win in a single electoral college seat because the Democrats and Republicans are the established parties. Not many people were willing to split their vote for an untested third-party candidate. So I feel like any thoughts that Trump is going to join a third party or have influence in a Patriot Party PAC is kind of dismissed. And I believe the Trump campaign has already dismissed that. There were some thoughts, particularly during Trump's presidency, that he might set up a media organization to promote himself, Trump TV, perhaps. Trump, during his presidency, was clearly obsessed with the way that the news media covered him and often felt that it was unfair. Even in the end, he turned on Fox. That's how bad it got, because Fox had the audacity to claim that the election was legitimate, meaning that more obscure and far more right-wing news TV broadcasters in OAN and Newsmax were probably the only ones that Trump trusted by the end. So that is another potential outlet for Trump. but I don't know if he wants to invest in that sort of media gamble. He might get a lot of support from it, but there have been no signs yet. And finally, the only news that broke earlier today was that there is the office of the former president that has been opened, and that's from Donald Trump, and that seems to be a way that he can release statements to the world now that he's off Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Pinterest, and whatever else.
And all of the services, yeah.
Yes, yep. where he can say his piece. My only thoughts on that is I'm not quite sure how many news media outlets will willingly pick up on that stuff if they don't have to. I've mentioned it lots of times, but Trump tweeted and you couldn't ignore it because he's the president. Now he says stuff and news media can kind of simply choose to ignore him. They don't have to give him camera time. Trump used to be a master of getting on TV and essentially like self-publicizing by getting on the news, and that was his form of advertising. And he got round having to advertise for anything because there was a controversy over the size of a flag outside of his golf course. Guess what? Everybody now knows that there's a Trump golf course in Florida, etc., etc. So, and he almost used that to his great effect in the 2016 election and in his primary election as leader of the Republican Party. News media outlets just kept covering and giving him a bigger voice because he was at the time seen as a joke candidate. But in fact, it meant that he didn't have to pay the same money as other candidates were having to pay to try and get their voices out there or send leaflets or do phone calls or whatever the traditional methods of polling was. Trump superseded that. I'm not quite sure he can carry on in that same vein, particularly after what happened on January 6th. I feel like he's seen as a bit toxic now, like officially toxic by most news media outlets. So inviting him on doesn't seem like such an attractive proposition anymore. And why would you? So
I mean, I'm sure it will still turn up on Fox News and places like that occasionally. But yeah, you would imagine that it will be downplayed, or it will be like a footnote to an article where they're like, oh, and Trump's released this statement on it. But, yeah, it's only right that they focus more on the current presidency. And speaking of, shall we move on to discussing the inauguration day for the new president, Biden?
I think in a massive contrast to the scenes that I described with Trump, for Biden, it was very different. Obviously, the inauguration this year was going to be different with the coronavirus and the fact that you'd had the situation on January the 6th, which meant there was a huge military presence in DC. So instead of crowds on the lawn outside Congress at the back, they had a parade of flags there. There was a small socially distanced crowd. I could see everyone had a mask on as far as I was concerned. When you had a look through the crowd, gave a very different message of sort of like responsibility. And this is what you do during a pandemic, which was just seeing that made me a bit happier because I was like, finally, just some sort of like responsibility. People will make their own mind up about masks and social distancing, I guess, but having somebody at the top of government do it and show you and take responsibility for that, I feel does have a slight impact on the way that people act or feel like they should act. But anyway, you had that going on. It was star-studded as well. You saw Lady Gaga, Jennifer Lopez, and Garth Brooks give different songs. I felt that was I felt all of those performers were picked by the Biden administration to get to cover everybody, to cover all the bases. Lady Gaga has clearly been with Biden, like she campaigned with him and there were several photos of them together. So she's clearly like in with that clan. Jennifer Lopez is clearly a shout out to kind of like a Latina community or showing like, this is America. We cover a lot of different, we're a race of many ethnicities and faiths, etc. So she was there to cover that base. Garth Brooks is an American Republican voting country singer, came out in jeans and a cowboy hat. So I think having him there and showing that he was somebody from across the aisle, again, feeds into that Biden message of unity. And finally, there was a tremendous reading from Amanda Gorman, the National Youth Poet Laureate.
Oh, that was so good, yes. So I think, I don't know if you've previously watched inaugurations in full, but this is the first time I've pulled up C-SPAN. C-SPAN's good because it puts it on YouTube, and B, they don't have any real commentary other than to be like, if they go between a shot to another shot, they might say, oh, we're moving over to here now for this thing, which is up next. So it's very good from that point of view. It's a bit like watching C-SPAN is like the equivalent of watching UK Parliament. But this is the first one I've ever watched. I didn't watch any of the Obama ones. I would have seen like clips on the news. But, it was another country's inauguration ceremony. It wasn't a thing I was going to watch. And then the Trump one I obviously didn't watch because I didn't like Trump. And then this time around, it has been was very joyful with a load of online American friends to sit on Discord and just like talk about how great the inauguration was. Because, as you say, it was such a stark difference because there are very few celebrities Trump was able to come out and perform for him. So I think he ended up having a load of so the Patriot dancers or something. It was a girls' dance troupe that he then famously refused to pay until they sued him to get their money. It was very, very Trump all round. And by comparison, as you say, you have these amazing performers. Everyone knows who they are. Very much feels like, very much. It had a very different tone to anything Trump, and it made it feel like a clean break. And then after all of that, as you say, Amanda Gorman came out, and that poem she delivered and the way she delivered it was excellent. It blew me away. And I think everyone was saying she was the standout kind of runaway famous moment of the inauguration, essentially. Moving on from that, the vice president is inaugurated first. So Kamala Harris gets up and does that. And then Biden gets inaugurated. And then he gave his first speech as president.
Yes, which I thought was competent as a leader. It's very strange going from Trump to Biden. Trump was somebody who, like, it was chaotic and you didn't know what he was going to say next. But for some reason, you felt like you had to listen. With Biden, I do feel there is a bit of like, I know they called him Sleepy Joe, but there is something about the way he speaks that's just a little more boring. And I don't mind that, particularly after the exciting, like the chaos of the previous 4 years. But I felt that he delivered his speech well. It was very much one that, far from Trump's, if you're comparing it back to 2016, Trump's speech then was all about American carnage. This one was about unity and getting people back together. I think one of the points that all the media organizations picked up on was that we must end this uncivil war that's happening in our country. Essentially saying that, like, right, now we've got past this, it's time to come together and try and overcome these big challenges in our country. And we can't do that if we're at each other's throats. We've got to be able to, reach across the aisle and work together both as citizens and in Congress. It's no secret that Biden is somebody who's been in Congress and worked in that system for years and years, and uniquely knows that system requires both parties to work together. If you want anything significant to go through there, you're always going to need somebody from the other party to come across to you or make concessions. There hadn't been a lot of that going on in the Trump administration. So, I feel that message was pointed both to people in Congress and outside. There was also a lot on references to the attack on the Capitol just weeks before. The reminders were all over the place, and it would have been remiss of him, I think, to ignore the fact that it happened. And I felt that that's the point where I think Biden thinks that everybody's got to sort of sit up and listen and go, right, this has gone far enough, because we talked about it at length last week. But for all the bad stuff that happened on January 6th, it could have gone a lot worse. Far more people could have been killed, for example, or like storming. There is an absolutely awful scenario that happens if assault weapons are fired, etc., with that many people in the Capitol. So they got away with that in a sense of how bad it could be, but they're never going to let that happen again. And part of never letting that happen again is you've got to tone down the rhetoric. You've got to try and bring together a very divided nation. That's a big challenge for Biden, and he even admitted it himself that some people might see those as empty words. And to mirror your point earlier on, like, I think America has always been this divided at some level. It's just that it's come to the forefront more over these past 4 years. So at least having someone like Biden in charge, setting the tone again, saying that, right, we've got to pursue a policy of more unity, of more truth as well. I felt that was striking. One of the big problems with the Trump administration was how willingly Trump would lie to the press. Fact checkers became a big feature of the Trump presidency. Biden is looking to restore faith in the office of president by promising to tell the truth more often and not treat media outlets with immediate disdain and disrespect, etc., etc. So, I felt it was probably the speech America needed at that time. I don't know if it was the greatest speech ever, but I think it certainly hit a lot of the right notes and got the presidency off to a good start. One that made me feel a lot calmer about the hands that America's now in.
I think it's interesting actually because Obama, a lot of his speeches I felt were shared in the run up to him becoming president. And so I had an understanding of what Obama sounded like a lot earlier on than I have with Biden. Obviously, Trump has been around for long enough now. It's hard to remember a time where I didn't know what he sounded like. But with Biden, I feel it's only really since like election, kind of just that run up to election day, that I saw a lot of footage of him talking and then started to kind of get a feel for him. And because well, he has this very measured way of talking that is very presidential. And then, yeah, as you say, the speech, as you say, it may not be the best speech ever, but it was one that was needed and it came over well. It was well delivered. And I think that's all he needed to do. Like, there's a lot of things where Biden will get a pass compared to Trump because it's like he just needs to be normal. So, yeah, I think that's true. So now let's maybe discuss the things he's done so far as president. So we mentioned executive orders earlier. I think it's interesting, actually, that one of the things as an outside observer that Trump did was by shattering norms generally meant you were more informed about what the norms originally were. So I'm sure Americans are well aware of this concept of having the first 100 days of the presidency, but it wasn't something I was aware of until Trump everyone was like, oh, is Trump going to do anything with his first 100 days? And there was a lot of talk from Trump about what he had done in his first 100 days. But then actually, in reality, he didn't necessarily achieve that much in his first 100 days. And so meanwhile, Biden has, as I say, been signing a flurry of executive orders in the first 6 days of the presidency. So can we dive into those a bit more?
Biden has released a lot of executive orders, which is one of the big powers that presidents have, and one that Trump was forced to use a lot because a lot of these orders were either controversial or he would have been unable to get them through both like the House and Senate in order to pass them. That was one of the downsides about Trump's combative nature, is the fact that he couldn't really get a lot of his policies through in the traditional manner. So he relied on executive orders, which are great for getting things done quickly. But unfortunately, it means as soon as you're out of power, it's very easy for the next president to come in and undo them. So Trump's presidency was kind of designed on undoing things that Barack Obama had done. Biden basically reverses those decisions and puts them back to how Obama would have done them. So I think one of the biggest examples of that was the Keystone Pipeline that was going to run through some Native American lands. Obama blocked that in the final days of his presidency. Trump allowed construction to carry on, and Biden has since again banned that. So that's a very quick one to fix. Biden's also overturned the very controversial Muslim ban and other rules on immigration. That Muslim ban came into effect very early on in the Trump presidency and had to be rewritten a number of times because it kept falling foul of constitutional hurdles and being challenged in courts, etc. I felt that was a sign of how Trump kind of just governed. He did, but he didn't really think of the consequences there. Biden was very quick to overturn that one as well. He also agreed that America has a bigger position in the world and started, whereas Trump's view was very isolationist, and he pulled them out of the Paris Accord and out of the WHO. One of Biden's first executive orders was to reinstate America's place with the Paris Treaty, which led to a bizarre tweet from Ted Cruz. I don't know if you saw that one. Ted Cruz said something to the effect of, "Oh, Biden's signed the Paris Treaty. I guess he sides more with the citizens of Paris than the citizens of Pittsburgh," which is
a complete misunderstanding of what the Paris Agreement is. It's
like, oh, blimey, Germany signed the Versailles Agreement. I guess they like Versailles more than they do the people of Stuttgart. It's just, you can't think that the people where the people of where the treaty was made, it's not their opinions. It's a wider view of everybody, of all the nations who are there together. But anyway, the USA is now back with the Paris Accords and with the WHO, which, as I said, shows more like they're back to that kind of global America wanting to be involved in these big decisions. I always found it bizarre that Trump was trying to pull them away from those things. He's also overturned Trump's ban on some more cultural issues. So this was as a reaction to Black Lives Matter and those and the conversations that was provoking amongst people. Trump set up this 1776 commission that kind of said agencies basically couldn't get involved in talking about race or anything, essentially saying that he felt that they were rewriting American history by trying to say that America was maybe a little bit at fault for all the bad, horrible racist stuff it had done in the past. Unsurprisingly, Biden has reversed that and said no, like racial equality training and all of this is very important and this should be promoted in government industries. There's also been an overturning of the ban of transgender people in the military, US military, something that Trump had enforced before. Biden has now overturned. So all of these things that Biden is doing within his first 100 days are kind of, I would say them as easy wins for him. He's able to overturn Trump executive orders that were unpopular, not only with the Democrats, but amongst quite a few Republicans as well, because they felt they overreached or appealed to a certain very Trumpy part of his base. The rest of them have all sort of been about coronavirus and having a quick response to that. There have been ones about vaccines. There's even been ones about travel bans for places such as ourselves, or having some sort of restrictions from individuals coming in from the UK into the US, because, of course, we've got new strains that Biden isn't very keen to have introduced to America. So, yes, I think a lot of those first 100 days, or at least not even 100 days now, is it? It's like the first 2 weeks of the Biden presidency has been quickly undoing what damage he can from the former Trump administration in those executive orders, and a bigger focus on coronavirus, which was obviously a topic that many felt Donald Trump didn't either take seriously or had underperformed in his task of managing. Now Biden is certainly saying that we are taking this incredibly seriously, but we wait to see how effective these measures are that Biden's put in.
As the kind of speed of these things that they've obviously been prepping for some time slows down, what's next on his to-do list? There are things he's said on the campaign trail, things we're expecting from him in these 100 days. What else is he going to move on to? I mean, he's already done some good things for coronavirus and as you say, racial equity, stuff like getting rid of the 1776 commission. But what is he doing going forwards?
Yeah, so one, I think the Biden presidency will be judged on its response to coronavirus in the long term and how effectively that vaccination program goes ahead. Clearly, the vaccination rollout is going to be the next big challenge for America. Who gets it? And in such a big country, how they get it and how it's distributed. I feel like that will be at the top of his agenda. There are clearly a lot of other forces in the Democratic Party pushing for change. I'd say most notably kind of coming from the more left wing, you'd have healthcare and the push for universal healthcare and how they can expand on what Obama was able to achieve with Obamacare. That might be more difficult just because the Senate is so close. It's only 50-50. It's not filibuster proof. In a way, I think it's very good that the Democrats are able to have a majority in the Senate with that casting vote from the vice president being there, but that doesn't leave you much wriggle room. And there may be some Democrats who, if it costs too much or doesn't quite match the needs of their constituents in their more, rural Democratic area or their like slightly less left-leaning Democratic area, that I don't think Biden can achieve the radical reform to healthcare that many on the left of his party want to achieve. So it'll be interesting to see how he addresses that problem and what he proposes. I don't think they'll be going to a universal healthcare NHS anytime soon under Biden, but I do feel that maybe some of that pushback against Obamacare, particularly when people have seen the impact of the pandemic, they realize how important it is to have that care and have it not cost people the earth. I'm hoping that at least some on the Republican side of the House can see that and will want to, work with Biden to get that across. On racial equality, clearly Biden can lead in a very different way to Trump and get rid of things like the 1776 Commission that I think actively cause racial tension, fixing the USA and making it a place that's less divided by race is an incredibly hard act to do. And, is it even possible for a president to achieve that within 4 years when such history is wrapped up in that? I don't think it's possible. It's going to have to be a generational thing.
Yeah, it's the long tail effect, like in the way that having Obama as the first black president meant that we had, people growing up now will see that they can be president. And it's the same thing where there was lots of nice, cute posts on Twitter going around of young girls watching Kamala be sworn in. And I think that's where you're going to start to see things with her being not only the first female, but also black and Asian American vice president. That really enforces that idea that, this is possible to younger Americans. But as you say, the upside of that is you're talking a 20 to 30 year lag before those kind of people are going to be approaching public office. So, it is definitely a step in the right direction, but it doesn't fix things right now. Obviously, it does make it like every time you shatter a taboo, it makes it easier for people to repeat it and continue to break that. So the not that I'm saying it was a taboo, but like it just hadn't happened before, and now that it has happened, there's maybe a chance that it's not just the kids who are watching it. There are people of all ages who might be like, well, I could do that now. And so, yeah, it's a kind of a trickle through effect. It's not something, as you say, that will happen in 4 years, but it is in the long term, making the right moves and trying to set things up and hopefully passing things that aren't just executive orders so that they're more permanent when a Republican comes in again and is maybe against those policies.
Yeah. One big thing that he might be able to do, clearly around the Black Lives Matter protests, there was a lot of discussion about defunding the police, or at least, a reform of how the police service in the United States uses that money, and how it's bizarre that the police force is usually so overfunded compared to other areas in states and cities, such as education, for example. I don't think that he will massively defund the police. He didn't run on that platform. That was a phrase that was used by a lot on the left of that party. Biden has always been seen as a more moderate on those cases, but I think that he will have to do something about reforming the police, and particularly how they deal with protests of that nature. We talked last time, didn't we, about how there was a marked difference between how the police dealt with the insurrection in the Capitol and how they dealt with Black Lives Matter protests. I think that might be, the president might have to stand up and take some responsibility, or at least try and enforce some change through Congress, where states and other federal agencies look at how they police mass protests in the future. And that might go some way to helping diffuse those sort of situations in the future. I think the other two big things that he's got to look at are foreign policy. We've always mentioned like the Paris Accords and going back into the WHO. I think his relationship with NATO will be a lot better than Trump in general, and you'll see more of that pushback to America. More of that push towards America being a friend and ally and willing to help, rather than with Trump. It always sort of came with a, you better pay us that money, right? Or, oh, by the way, we can walk away from this and leave you guys hanging anytime we want. There was more of that threat with Trump that he wasn't going to support his allies. Now I feel that Joe Biden is more secure in that sense when it comes to working with the EU and the UK, for example. There was a little bit of kerfuffle and a worry about how Biden would treat the UK. The Churchill bust has been removed. I don't know if you heard the kerfuffle about that happening. But I think the relationship between Britain and the UK will still remain a special relationship. But the fact we're out of the EU does give us our own little weird status. And I'd be very interested to see how the Biden administration treats us. Are we as important to them now, or are we actually less important because we're outside of that trading bloc? I'd be really interested to see how they react to that. All I do know is that President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson had a conversation. It was quite telling about what both sides' release of that transcript. The UK released and said, oh yes, no, we talked about trade and a possible trade deal being discussed. The US didn't mention that. Their side of that conversation didn't mention that at all, which kind of suggests it's lower down the priority list for the US, and it's far higher up the UK's list to try and get a deal with America. So, yeah, I think on a personal level, or at least on a British level, that's what we've got to be looking out for from a foreign policy perspective. And finally, we've got the environment. There was a lot that was discussed, particularly on the left of the Democratic Party, again, about a possible Green New Deal. Again, Biden's talk on that aspect was kind of more subdued. I think it's no doubt that we'll get a more environmentally friendly president in Biden than we did in Trump. But how far that goes, how far he does to kind of enforce environmental standards on American goods to make them more energy efficient, for example, or how much he kind of promotes, big infrastructure projects around green energy, that's kind of the sliding scale. And I wonder how far he's going to go along it. There might be some pushback, particularly from the more conservative Democratic members in his party, against those bigger public work projects that might be needed, that I think that people envisage when they say Green New Deal. But yeah, that's, again, fixing the environment is not a small task, and clearly it's not just up to America to do. That is a global issue. But America is clearly one of the biggest contributors of CO2 and has to take a stand personally about taking some responsibility about that stuff. And I feel Biden will at least feel some need to be responsible in that area.
And I think one thing we've touched on before is that it's important that there is, obviously there are lots of EU countries trying to deal with the environment as well. If one of the big international players, the US, is not playing ball, that very much undercuts whether the agreement is worth having. And then you get people saying, oh, well, they're not doing it, so why should we be spending all this money on stuff like this? And the point is the environment is for everyone, and we should. And the US taking that lead is important from that point of view because they still have an important weight on the global stage. Briefly wanting to touch on, as we wrap up, the mention of the UK-US special relationship. I think there is still some, like, I don't think, as you say, not being in the single market does make things a bit different. It's not like we are the English gateway to that trading bloc anymore. But I think there is still this kind of feeling of we're kind of a bit more kindred spirits than with the rest of Europe. And so therefore, like, I could see certain things like finance stuff still going on because London still has, all these financial companies that exist, for example. And maybe it will take on a different tone, but I feel like there's definitely going to be a need for it, but we're just going to have to see how it evolves over time.
Yeah, certainly. As with all of this stuff, Biden's been president.
Yeah, we can't really predict based off that. So I don't think we're going to do any polls this week because there aren't any. It's kind of a strange time to be in. We've always had either a US or UK poll going on. I mean, sure, polling is going on, but there's nothing on the horizon looming that really needs our analysis right now. So we're not going to have a poll section today. And maybe, again, another thing, if you find an interesting poll you'd like us to discuss, we can use this as a section in future episodes to kind of discuss something that is interesting. There's always opinion polls about something going on, but it'd be nice to have something that's a bit more fun and light at the end of the show, probably. So if you find any fun polls, send them our way and we'll discuss them. Yes. I mean, there will definitely be. I don't know if it's a thing we're going to need to discuss on a fortnightly basis, though. It might be the kind of thing where, a big thing has happened. How has that affected his standing in the polls? As opposed to, I don't think we need to be following the polls quite as much as we were, which is kind of freeing in a way, which I like. And then, as always, you can find us in all the usual places. You can go to parliamentary.observer and find links to all of our various places around the internet. You can find us on Reddit, Facebook, etc. As I say normally, the best thing you can do if you like this is share it with a friend, tell them why you like us and why they should listen. And of course, if you want to go the extra mile, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS. You can become a patron and then you can get access to our kind of exclusive episode we record beforehand where we banter about video games and how our lives are in lockdown and other things, which is how we kind of get into the flow for the podcast. And with that said, I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Join Mike and Tom for nerdy conversation with a multitude of guests on Hat of Many Things.
Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I'm Mark, a librarian and professional wrestling ring announcer.
I cast League of Legends.
Soteros Filbricato, best known for my work with White Wolf and Onyx Path Publishing on the World of Darkness.
Hi, I'm Jason Carl. I'm the producer of V5 at White Wolf.
Yeah, my name is Johanna Pettersson. I'm a Finnish game designer.